Hello, everyone. I am sorry that I can't be with you this month live, but grateful for technology that we can still study a bit together. And on this page down below, there's a reply button. I'm going to ask you some questions that if we were live, we'd discuss in person or discuss together. But because we're not, I would love to hear your responses. And so have that mouse ready or that finger ready to click the reply button when you get to some of those questions. But before we dive into anything, thank you so much for everything you are doing for your students. I know that spring can sometimes be a great time of year, and sometimes it can be a difficult time of year. Sometimes the warming up and the lightening up brings some students that were a little bit sleepier in the colder months out of their shell. Sometimes I know that it can be students can lose focus, their attention can wane as things get a little bit closer to the end of the school year. So just thank you. Thank you for participating in our monthly faculty meetings, for reading the weekly messages, for teaching and studying and sharing and preparing and doing everything that you do. Your influence cannot be overstated. Now, I am actually really sad that we don't get to study live together because coming up this next month are some of, if not my absolute favorite books in the Book of Mormon. They're kind of the forgotten books. We love First Nephi, and hopefully we now love Second Nephi after teaching it, knowing that this was Nephi's kind of magnum opus, the Second Nephi book. And then we hit Jacob, Enos, Jerem, and Omni, and with maybe the exception of a chapter or two in Jacob, certainly Enos, but definitely not Jerem and Omni, we're just kind of in a hurry to get to Mosiah and Alma and all the stories there that we love. And maybe it's that reason why I love these books, but I think there's a deeper reason. There is a principle in these chapters that for me has been life-changing. I think for us as disciples of Christ can be life-changing. And I think there's even some application for us as teachers and certainly for our students. And so if we can, I want to dive into that principle as we study today. Now, for a bit of background, I love survival TV shows. I don't know if any of you watch Survivor, if any of you still watch that. We got into that show about 10 years ago, and we love it. We watch every season. We pick favorites of who we think is going to win that season. We love the challenges. I even have a book written by a Survivor contestant. Recently, I have been introduced to and love the show Alone. I think it's on the History Channel. And unlike Survivor, where they put 20 people on an island and have them live together and vote each other off, Alone is the exact opposite. They take 10 people into the most remote place they can find that season, Patagonia, for example. And they deposit them all miles away from each other. So each person's in an individual location. They get one backpack of supplies, and all 10 of them are wilderness survival experts. But they get this backpack, and they are left alone. And the last person standing wins the game. Sometimes that's 30, 40, 50 days that they are stranded. And there's kind of this pattern that they go through, and maybe this is the reason why I like the shows. There's something about carving out a place from the unknown or from the uncertain. Something about making home out of a wilderness that has always just captivated me. All of the contestants usually go through the first phase of the show somewhat similarly. It's just bare survival. Can I make a basic shelter? Can I find food and water? Am I going to be safe? And sometimes they don't make it. There's animals that are around. Sometimes there's predators, and they tap out. They go home. But once they've made it past that first week or so, that's when you really see the difference between the players, the contestants on the show that are there to just kind of grin and bear it, and those that really want to enjoy the experience. And those that want to enjoy the experience are the ones I like watching the most, because they will try and make this wilderness that they've been given into a home. They'll make a shelter or a fort with an indoor fireplace and a place to dry or smoke their fish. One guy one season made running water and a bowling alley. It's fascinating to me. Well, with that background, it's maybe then no surprise that I love this insight about Jacob. If you go back to the very first reference to Jacob in the Book of Mormon, this is in 1 Nephi chapter 18, verse 7. there's a word that's used in connection with Jacob that's used the first time he's mentioned and the second to last verse that we talk about him. So this is 1 Nephi 18:7. This is Nephi, and he says, "And now my father had begat 2 sons in the wilderness. The elder was called Jacob, and the younger Joseph." Then, if you read at the very end of Jacob, this is Jacob chapter 7, verse 26. Jacob says, "And it came to pass that I, Jacob, began to be old, and the record of this people being kept on the other plates of Nephi, wherefore I conclude this record, declaring that I have written according to the best of my knowledge, by saying that the time passed away with us, and also our lives passed away, like as it were unto us a dream, we being a lonesome and a solemn people, wanderers, cast out from Jerusalem, born in tribulation, in a wilderness, and hated of our brethren, which caused wars and contentions, wherefore we did mourn out our days." Now, that's kind of maybe a depressing verse to read, but I think it's a bit of an autobiography of sorts of Jacob's life. Think of the difference between Jacob and Nephi, for example. Nephi's born in Jerusalem to a pretty wealthy family and to some kind of success and acclaim, and he lives his formative years there until the family leaves. Jacob, however, is born in the wilderness. He's born into uncertainty. He's got brothers, a family that's tearing itself apart, and his life is anything but sure and certain. Which makes, I think, the writings of Jacob, and we'll see his son Enos and Jacob-Omni and those that write in those books, I think really relatable to us when we're going through uncertain things, uncertain times, and to our students who live in a world of uncertainty. In fact, the Hebrew word for wilderness, midbar, means a desert place, an uninhabited place, a place of uncertainty and even chaos. And I think that our teenagers especially, and we as well, maybe know what that feels like. Before we go any further, here's where I would love to ask a question if we were live. And so here's where I would love to have you, if you can, pause after you hear the question, go down to the bottom, click reply, and type in an answer. The question is, what wildernesses have you been in? Or what wildernesses do you see your students going through? In other words, what are the times or the places or the experiences in your life that have felt most uncertain or unsure or chaotic? Or if you want to talk about your students, what are some of the moments in their lives that you sense are most disconcerting to them, confusing to them, uncertain or chaotic to them? Will you pause right now, go down to the bottom, and just share some of your observations? Now, once you've done that, I want to throw a cross-reference in here before we look a little bit closer at what Jacob, Enos, Jacob-Omni write. Jacob, of course, is named after Jacob in the Old Testament. And if you go to Genesis chapter 32, there's this little unique experience that Jacob has. He's on his way to meet his brother Esau. They're estranged. And he's in the wilderness with his family. And it says in verse 22, they passed over the ford of Jabbok. And then in verse 24, it says, and Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Now, we don't know exactly what this experience was, if he was wrestling a man or an angel. But at some level, it seems that the individual he was wrestling had been divinely invested to represent the Lord. And so, in a sense, Jacob here is wrestling the Lord. The word Jacob means to wrestle, as we have learned from President Nelson. And if you read this in Hebrew, there's a play on words here that you don't catch if you read it in English. I'm going to show it to you here. First of all, the place name Jabbok, where they're at, in Hebrew, Yabok. The name Jacob is Yaakov, and the word wrestle, especially the word the Lord wrestles, is Yah-abek. So if you were to read this in Hebrew, you would say that Yaakov had a Ya'abek in Yabok. I think that the author here is deliberately trying to pinpoint our attention on this wrestle. On this moment where Jacob tries to wrestle the Lord, tries to wrestle what he wants from the Lord. And as you know, it doesn't work. He wrestles to his own exhaustion and then is forced to conclude that he cannot wrestle. He cannot fight his way to what he wants. When we're in wilderness moments, I don't know about you, but for me and for many teenagers that I've talked to, that is exactly the response that we often have in those wrestling moments. We want to fight. We want to figure things out. We want to make sure that what we've got in our minds and what we have planned to do can really work. And unfortunately for us, that doesn't often work. So the second question I have is, what are the things in those wilderness moments that you, if you're talking about your wilderness moment, or your students, are most prone to Jacob? What are the things that they are most prone to wrestle for in their lives? What are the things that they're most prone to go their own way, do their own will, to see if they can muscle it out? What are those things that cause us or cause our students to wrestle? Now, in the Book of Mormon, we see that wrestle. Jacob has to deal with a people who, at least one way to describe their sin, is trying to wrestle without reference to the Lord or his plan. Remember Jacob chapter 2, he begins this sermon. But it's interesting how he describes the beginning of his sermon. Jacob uses a word in his writing that's really kind of unique to him. He says, this is Jacob chapter 2, verse 3, "You yourselves know that I have hitherto been diligent in the office of my calling, but I this day am weighed down with much more desire and anxiety for the welfare of your souls than I have hitherto been." He used as that verse also when he addresses the Nephites back in 2 Nephi chapter 6. He talks about his great anxiety, and he uses it in verse 5 as well in chapter 1. So Jacob is filled with anxiety about what he has to talk about, worry and stress, because what the Nephites are going through is causing them some serious problems, and he has to be the one to address it. Well, the problem he identifies then is in verse 13, right in the middle of the verse, that you are lifted up in the pride of your hearts, and wear stiff necks and high heads because of the costliness of your apparel, and persecute your brethren because you suppose that you are better than they. And then in verse 16, that he would rid you from this iniquity and abomination, and that you would listen to the words of his commands, and let not this pride of your hearts destroy your souls. One way to describe the word pride is to say pride is the sin of thinking that you can do it by yourself, or thinking that you have done it by yourself. If humility means looking at and acknowledging God's presence in your life, his strength and his power, pride then is the opposite, to acknowledge that, or to think that you are the sole source of your blessing, of your strength, or that you are the sole solution to whatever wilderness or problem you might be facing. Now pose that to your students and see if they can resonate with what it feels like to be trapped in the moment where you think like, I have to do this alone. I have to fight this wilderness by myself, and no one's going to help me. It's a very common feeling. Now, Enos, Jacob's son, deals with a similar problem. When we read Enos, we love the focus on prayer. And I've heard it taught, in fact, I've even taught this in past years, that the way that Enos describes his prayer is that he has this wrestle with God. And so we talk about Enos's wrestle with the Lord. But it's interesting, as I read this last time, I noticed something that I hadn't before. Even though Enos does, he says in verse 4, have this mighty prayer, he uses the word wrestle before he gets to his prayer. This is verse 2. He says, I will tell you of the wrestle which I had before God, before I received a remission of my sins. Meaning, I don't know if wrestling was the key to receiving forgiveness for his sins. I think wrestling might have been Enos going through something that maybe Jacob, his father's namesake, went through. He's in a wilderness. In fact, verse 1, he goes into the wilderness to pray, maybe learning from his father the importance of wilderness moments and overcoming them. But then he has this wrestle in the wilderness. It's very reminiscent of Jacob. Jarom, Enos's son, does something kind of unique at the beginning of his book. This is verse 1. He says, "Now behold, I, Jarom, write a few words according to the commandment of my father Enos, that our genealogy may be kept." Remember when Nephi said, I think it was back in 1 Nephi chapter 6, that excuse me, that his children, he gave a commandment that he and his children were to occupy these small plates with only sacred things. And he specifically said that he would not keep a genealogy on the plates. Well, here's Jarom breaking that commandment. But I think he does it for a reason. If you read in verse 3, Jarom says, "Behold, it is expedient that much should be done among this people, because of the hardness of their hearts, and the deafness of their ears, and the blindness of their minds, and the stiffness of their necks." That stiff necks is the same way that Jacob used to describe pride. So much so that in verse 8, even as they're multiplying exceedingly, they now have to make weapons of war and to prepare for war with the Lamanites. I think Jacob tells his genealogy on this record, I think to remind his people of where they came from and maybe to tie them together. Someone told me a story once of an aging mother who commanded her children every year to gather together for a family picture. That she wasn't as concerned about the family picture as she was about them gathering together. I think Jarom is doing something similar here and connecting his people to their family, maybe to their ancestors, and trying to remind them of where they came from. At any rate, we see this beginning of this story in Jarom where they're preparing for war. And then when we get to Omni, we have another surprise. Again, Omni keeps a genealogy in verse 1 on the plates. But then in verse 2, describes himself as a very wicked man. And then in verse 3, describes what he has done in his day. He says, "In the 276 years have passed away. We've had many seasons of peace, and we have had many seasons of serious war and bloodshed." In verse 5, I caught this the last time through and I wrote, "Whoa, what?" in my scriptures. We always think of the war chapters as being the primary places for war and destruction, or maybe at the end of the Book of Mormon. But verse 5, "It came to pass that 320 years had passed away, and the more wicked part of the Nephites were destroyed." That's a huge event. This destruction of Nephites that comes because of contention. And that contention comes because of pride, because of wrestling, because of fighting. So here's this theme throughout all of these chapters. In fact, just to throw one more on there, you go to the end of the book of Omni. This is verse 24. "Behold," this is now Amaleki writing, but he says, "Behold, I have seen in the days of King Benjamin a serious war and much bloodshed between the Nephites and the Lamanites." Mormon describes that at the end of the Words of Mormon, where he'll talk about how Benjamin took up the sword of Laman to fight against the armies of the Lamanites, and there's this massive war. And I know we think of Benjamin as this very peaceful, aged king that dispenses wisdom. But in his earlier years, Benjamin is fighting in this war, which maybe is one of the reasons why he's such a proponent of proclaiming peace and love and charity and treating other people equally. Whatever the reason, we have this thread starting in Jacob all the way through the end of the book of wrestling in the wilderness, trying to fight. And I'm just not convinced that that's what the Lord would have us do. So, what would the Lord have us do? This is going to be a fabulous study for your students this month. What would the Lord have us do when we are in these wilderness moments? If it's not wrestling, if it's not fighting, if it's not going our own way or trying to force something to happen, well, then what is it? I won't rob you or your students of that fabulous study that you can have throughout this month, but I will maybe pose one answer to you from two different sources. First, this is back in Enos. We read that Enos has a wrestle before he receives a remission of his sins. It's interesting then to read the way that Enos actually describes his prayer. Verse 4, he calls it a mighty prayer for his own soul, for his whole soul, he says in verse 8. And then in verse 9, he uses this wonderful language. It says, "It came to pass that when I had heard these words, I began to feel a desire for the welfare of my brethren the Nephites. Wherefore I did pour out my whole soul unto God for them." Now, this isn't a Greek translation, the Book of Mormon isn't, but there is a Greek word that is often translated as to pour out. The Greek word is kenosis. And the idea of kenosis is that you take something that is filled and you pour it out to make space for something else. Notice the way that Enos describes this. He is made whole in verse 8 because of his prayer. And once he's made whole, he then pours out his whole soul to God for his brethren. He takes what he has and pours it out to now make space for something else God wants to put into his heart or in his life. I think the opposite of wrestling is this kenosis, this pouring out. And maybe this is reading too much into it, but I wonder if Enos goes through a wrestling moment in the wilderness, which is maybe why it took him so long, until he finally reaches the point that in order to receive what he wants, in order to receive what the Lord wants for him, he has to do the opposite of go his own way. He has to empty himself of his own desires, of his own thoughts, of his own actions, so that God can touch him, inspire him, and fill him with what the Lord sees and what the Lord wants. To put it another way, well, let me show you this, actually. You want something interesting? We'll read this quote here in a second. But if I go to the church website right here, and if I just search for the word uncertainty, whoops, not the Worldwide Relief Society devotional. If I search for the word uncertainty, and then I filter this, maybe you know you can do this, you can filter results here by anything over on the side, and you can filter by date. It's a great way to find recent addresses. So I'm going to filter this by the past 5 years. Notice who the most pronounced speaker is on uncertainty. April 7th, 2020, a month after the pandemic starts, hear him. When we are surrounded by uncertainty and fear. April 2nd, 2022, the power of spiritual momentum. Positive spiritual momentum will keep us moving forward amid the fear and uncertainty created by pandemics, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and armed hostilities. Overcome the world and find rest. October 1st, find the rest from the intensity, uncertainty, and anguish of this world. Think Celestial, this last new general conference, October 3rd, 2023. An understanding of God's fabulous plan takes the mystery out of life and the uncertainty out of the future. A New Normal, October 3rd, 2020. President Nelson has been talking about wildernesses and uncertainties since the beginning of his time as president of the church, and probably before that as well. Is it any wonder, then, that President Nelson was the one to teach us that this experience Jacob has, where he wrestled with a serious challenge, he learned this. Through this wrestle, Jacob proved what was most important to him. He demonstrated that he was willing to let God prevail in his life. Remember, Jacob's name, Jacob, which means to wrestle, or the Lord wrestles, was changed to Israel, which means let God prevail. In response, God changed Jacob's name to Israel, meaning let God prevail. God then promised Israel that all the blessings that had been pronounced upon Abraham's head would also be his. The question for each of us is the same. Are you willing to let God prevail in your life? Are you willing to let God be the most important influence in your life? Will you allow his words, his commandments, and his covenants to influence what you do each day? Will you allow his voice to take priority over any other? Are you willing to let whatever he needs you to do take precedence over every other ambition? Are you willing to have your will swallowed up in his? In other words, are you willing to pour yourself out, to pour out your whole soul, to empty yourself of any pride, any selfishness, and to truly make space for what God would have you think and feel and do? Now that is a powerful question for us, and it's a powerful question for our students. So as you study with them this month, help them to ask this question in multiple different ways and in multiple different places. Help them to ask that specifically, what would God have me think, feel, and do? What do I need to pour out of my soul to make space for him? The third question, down on the bottom of this page to click reply to, I would love to know what thoughts come to your mind when you think of how you can help students to turn their focus from their own thoughts, feelings, and actions to the Lord's thoughts, feelings, and actions. How do you help a student let God prevail? Maybe you have some experiences already where you've seen that happen in an individual student's life, or you've seen it happen on a class level. Or maybe just now as you're thinking about it, some thoughts come to mind for how you could help a student let God prevail. Well, at the bottom of this page, will you click reply? And for the answer to the third question there, will you share some of the thoughts and the insights that come to you? Brothers and sisters, I bear my testimony that God has so much in store for us. As teachers, we might head into a class thinking that we know best or that we have the best idea or plan. And you know this from your own experience, that sometimes, oftentimes, the very best experiences come when we turn ourselves over to the Lord, when we let him direct what we think and what we say and what we do in class. I bear my testimony that the Lord is real. He does provide that kind of direction. I know what it feels like to be in wildernesses like you. I know what it feels like to wrestle. I am currently in a wilderness with members of my extended family, and I'm currently wrestling with trying not to wrestle and trying to turn my life over to God and to turn what happens in my family over to God. And it's not easy. But I'm grateful that I have a God that I can have confidence in, that I'm not worried about what will happen if I let God prevail. I'm not worried about what he will do if he takes control. I'm not worried about what will happen if I pour out my soul to him. And so I bear testimony of him and of his goodness and ability to direct our lives and to direct our students' lives. Thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for the answers that you will give. If you have any questions or comments, I'm out of town for the next 2 weeks, but I am available. I check email periodically, and I can even find time away for a phone call or a text message if something comes up, so feel free to reach out to me. But thank you so much for all that you do, brothers and sisters. May God bless you this week and this month in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.